Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that I am seeing a couple of attendees that have grayed out phone icons next to their names. In this case, we need you to enter your audio PIN numbers so that we can mute you and we have clean audio for our panelists. So just make sure to enter that for us. Thanks. My name is Marie from the Innovation Group, and welcome to another Emerging Leaders of Gaming webinar. I just want to give you a brief overview on the functionality of GoToWebinar before we get started. So you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation that I'm sharing with you, and this slide shows where your various windows are, including panelist cameras, this PowerPoint presentation, which is available in the handouts window, and the control panel. You can choose to follow along with us to view the presentation or download it directly and go through it at your own speed. The next slide shows how to expand any of these separate windows to go to full screen. Just click on the double arrows at the bottom right corner of your selected window, or to escape full screen, click those arrows again or hit the escape button. You can also minimize and maximize your control panel by clicking the orange arrow at the top. You'll notice that you're automatically muted throughout the webinar, but to ask questions, expand your control panel and look toward the bottom right in the questions section. Just type your question and hit send, and we'll reserve 10 minutes at the end to cover as many questions as possible. If you're on a mobile phone, your functionality will be slightly more limited, but you'll see your menu items at the bottom. To toggle back and forth between panelist cameras and the presentation, swipe from left to right. And to advance through the presentation on your own, since you won't be able to see ours live, swipe down for each new slide. The menu also shows where you can access the presentation, also called handouts, or ask a question. As for frequently asked questions, if you run into any technical issues during the webinar, call the GoToWebinar customer service team at the number that I've been displaying at the tops of all these slides. Also, we'll post a recording of this webinar on our Emerging Leaders page within a few days, so stay tuned for that. And now here's the Innovation Group's Operations Planning Director, Mike Vinaski, to kick things off.
Thanks for the tech instructions, Marie. For those of you who have recently joined us, welcome to the Emerging Leaders of Gaming panel discussion on sports betting. This session is being brought to you by the Innovation Group. Sports betting has been a topic of debate for many years within the U.S. Despite being available and regulated in many international jurisdictions, sports betting is only available in a few domestic markets. While opinions may vary on when a widespread legal market may take place and whether or not the American society can handle this shift in sports culture, experts agree that expanded legalized sports betting is inevitable. For the domestic gaming industry, the eventual widespread legalization of sports betting presents a diverse set of opportunities. We're hoping to shed some light on these opportunities and provide a broad overview of the domestic sports betting market during this webinar. We have a set of questions to ask our panelists, and we'll also be accepting questions from the audience throughout the discussion. We'll leave time at the end of the webinar to allow our panelists to address the audience questions. Before I introduce the panelists, I'll introduce myself. As Marie said, my name is Mike Vinaski. I'm a director with the Innovation Group's Denver office, and Marie is our behind-the-scenes co-host. She's our marketing manager and is also out of the Denver office. With that, we'll introduce our panelists and have them tell us a little bit about themselves. Our first panelist is Will Green. Will is the Senior Director of Research at the American Gaming Association.
Hey guys, good to be here. My name is Will Green. I'm our Senior Director. I focus on the research side of things with somewhat of an emphasis on sports betting research. Obviously, there's a ton of momentum behind this issue, so it's a very exciting time to be a part of just learning more about this and helping sort of drive the momentum forward on sports here in the U.S. So thanks to the Innovation Group for having me, and it's great to be here.
Thanks, Will. Our next panelist is Dan Kostelski. Dan is the co-founder and CEO of Chalkline Sports.
Thank you, Mike. My name is Dan Kostelski. I've operated online sportsbook in Africa. Started one in 2009, and sold that to a big land-based casino group in Africa in 2013. I since moved back to the United States and ran an online horse racing business. Since then, we've started Chalkline Sports, which is it's a media an audience monetization platform for gaming companies. It's a B2B white label solution for regulated and soon to be regulated markets, sports betting markets across the globe. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Dan. And our final panelist is Dan Shapiro. Dan is the VP of Strategy and Business Development at William Hill.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks to the Innovation Group for inviting me to be part of the webinar. For those that don't know, William Hill is the biggest sportsbook operator in Nevada. We've got 108 sportsbooks throughout the state, and we also have a mobile app. You can sign up for any of our sportsbooks. Really looking forward to talking about how sports betting looks in the U.S. and how it might look down the line as changes to PASPA and legal status in various states might occur over the next several years.
Great, thanks, Dan. We're happy to have Will and both Dans here joining us today, and are excited to learn from their experience and knowledge. Just want to mention again before we jump into the questions, attendees, please remember to submit your questions directly via the Q&A functionality. We're limited on time, so I'll go ahead and get started with the questions. So our first question, what is the state of the sports betting industry within the U.S., and how does this compare with international jurisdictions? Dan Shapiro, we'll start with you.
Sure. So in the U.S., most sports betting, some estimates up to 99% of sports betting is illegal. However, the way it looks now, as far as legal sports betting, Nevada is really the only state with a full legal sports betting product. There's 190 sports books spread out throughout Nevada where you can go and place bets. They're all within casinos, and at many of those casinos, you can also sign up for a mobile account, a mobile app, and place bets throughout the state, wherever you may be in the state, using the apps track customers using geolocation technology. We'll talk about the market size in Nevada in a little bit. The other state with any sports betting of significance is Delaware, where parlay betting is offered on NFL games only, and it has to be a parlay of 3 or more games, and that was due to a court decision. The Delaware sports betting launched in 2009, relaunched, I should say, in 2009 after the state passed a bill, reauthorizing the sports lottery there. Currently, sports betting is available at the 3 racetrack casinos in Delaware, and also at about 100 or so lottery retailers throughout the state. These are bars, restaurants, liquor stores, convenience stores. The way that differs from many international markets, including the UK, is that in the US, at least in Nevada, the sports betting licenses are tied to land-based casinos. In the UK, you've got betting shops, standalone betting shops with, and there's about close to 10,000 of those in the country, where you can walk in, place a bet. There's no alcohol served in those venues, but they're really sort of transactional sort of venues. And then in the UK, you've got a full offering of online sports betting. So you can sign up for an account with a wide variety of operators, both with retail footprints and without, and bet throughout the UK and through many countries in Europe. So different model in the US from Europe, but the important thing to remember is most of the sports betting is still going on in the US illegally. Nevada is the really only state with a full legal sports betting menu.
Just to add to that, Mike, in the UK, sports betting is probably about 30% of the total gaming GGR. Other places like Africa, it's 15 to 20%. And here in the United States and in Nevada specifically, it's about 2% of GGR. So obviously across the nation, it's far less than that. And it gives you a good indication of the opportunity that exists here in the United States, comparing it to some other legal jurisdictions. Specifically here in the U.S., about 38% of all the handle in Nevada is on NFL or is on football. About 31% of that is on basketball, and about 23% of that is on baseball. And over the past 5 years, what we're looking at is we're looking at growth. The drivers of growth of sports betting is really baseball's improved about 50% over the past 5 years, and basketball's been 43%. So the drivers of that growth in Nevada is sitting with basketball and baseball.
Just one other point to add to what the Dans, we'll call them the Dans, I like that. One other point to add to sort of what Dan chimed in with, from a structural standpoint, there's not really like a federal oversight capacity or regulatory capacity when it comes to sports, here in the U.S. However, it's really it's a state-by-state issue in a lot of regulatory and statutory instances. In Nevada, for example, there are just countless state regulations and state statutes or elements therein that govern sports betting quite robustly, and they maintain, quite impressive just requirements for sportsbook operators to adhere to, as opposed to some sort of federalized scheme. And like, Dan said, there are certainly other product offering differences as well. And yet, despite the structural and the product differences, if you look at the UK, a market where, it's obviously sports betting is incredibly mature and it's been around for, a very long time and in many, many forms, you see consumer spend per capita on sports betting annually look a little bit, in some instances, like Nevada. Some of our data indicates that between $40 and $50 per person are spent on sports betting annually in Nevada. You look at some European countries and that's way higher. You look at other European markets and that number is way lower. So despite the structural and the sort of the product-oriented differences, you do nonetheless see U.S. consumers participating in terms of volume and consumer spend in an encouraging way in this market.
Thanks, guys. That's a good lead into our next question, which is what is the current size of the domestic sports betting market, both legal and illegal? And what will happen to this size of the market if it becomes legal in more places? We'll stay with you for now.
Sure. So two terms that you heard these gentlemen both refer to in the responses to the last question were handle and GGR. Handle, otherwise known as turnover, is just essentially the amount bet by all people on a game or an event. GGR, an acronym referring to gross gaming revenue, and that is, of course, wins, minus payouts back to consumers. So it's two different measures, often closely linked, but two different measures sort of monetary, success or size of the sports betting market. So when you look at America, when you say what is the size of the domestic market, what that really means is Nevada, and then of course you would add in Delaware, Delaware's numbers as well. Those are the only two states that are currently running sports betting. The handle in America here is about 4.5, a little higher than 4.5 billion. That is a number that was, of course, that's a 2016 number. We don't have 2017 at this point. That was, I believe, a record for the or at least an increase for the 7th straight year. GGR last year, I believe, clocked in. And I'll let Dan Shapiro correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe if you add in Delaware, Delaware's GGR as well was just a little bit over 220 million last year, something like that, nationwide. That's gross gaming revenue, of course. And then speaking to Dan's other point from earlier, then you have, of course, the illegal market, which we estimate to be in the high 90s. I think our estimate's around 97% of the entire sports betting market in this country. And of course, those numbers, because they're such a larger proportion of the overall pie, are much higher. We have AGA's own estimates, but I mean, you don't have to take our word for it. Look at Ernst & Young, look at H2 Gambling Capital, look at Eilers & Krejcik. I mean, we have estimates that are consistently within a range, at least on handle, of between about $140 and $170 billion annually bet illegally on sports here in the U.S. So, I mean, that's just an absolutely massive number, which I think underscores several things in terms of consumer demand for this product, demand for a legal and a regulated and a safe market. And it's a very popular activity. And I think when you get to the second question, what will happen to the size of the market, if this becomes legal? We actually worked with economists from Oxford University to commission a study that measures several figures. I won't go in depth in all the detail there, but among them were those two, handle and GGR. We estimate that if sports betting were offered at just brick and mortar and retail locations, not even involving the online component, we'd estimate a handle somewhere between about 130 and 170 billion dollars annually. That's not involving online. Even that would raise it much higher. But again, right now, handle is about 4.5 billion. All 50 state opt-in, brick and mortar, legal regulated environment, you'd be looking at we'll average it out, we'll say 150 billion. That's massive. I mean, that is a big market. And we also estimate that would generate about 5 billion in total taxes, state, federal, and local. And you'd be looking at about 10 to 11 billion in gross gaming revenues. And now that's about $250 million, not even. So that's those are what our research projections tell us, sort of along the lines of that question.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Go ahead, Dan. I was going to say, Will and the AGA, they've done some really good research and done some really good work with Oxford. But I think from our perspective, the market could be even bigger. Nobody really knows, of course. We're taking really educated guesses and doing some really good research on it. But if you go back to the 1999 National Impact Gambling Study, they estimated handle at upwards of 400 billion. So you've got a range there where something like 100, 150 billion could actually be on a very low side when you consider all the illegal activity going on in the U.S. between offshore websites, street bookies, mob-connected bookies, those types of things. It could be even higher. The answer to the question is nobody really knows, but we know it's a huge, huge market.
Yeah, and I would just add that when we look at the numbers and that we just use that 150 billion, we estimate that that's about 30 million Americans right now that are betting on sports. So yeah, the impact that Will is talking about, will probably double that if it becomes legal.
We actually we have a poll from Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner. They're a very well respected polling firm here on the East Coast. About 20% of Americans say that they bet on sports last year. I don't know exactly what that calculates out to in terms of the number of Americans of legal betting age, but this is not a marginalized activity, is I guess the point that we're trying to make. This is a mainstream activity that has social acceptance, and it's growing by all the measures that Dan and myself, I think, just mentioned.
Yeah, so clearly it's a massive opportunity. And that leads us into the next question. Despite this big opportunity, it's still kind of been held up in the political processes. So what are the biggest political obstacles facing the sports betting industry right now in the U.S.? And would a favorable Supreme Court ruling and the passage or repeal of a federal sports betting law enable widespread implementation? Dan Kostelski, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the biggest political hurdle is repealing of PASPA. I think that, and I'm no lawyer, I've certainly observed the industry for long enough. I do think that one of the biggest challenges that I do see is that if that happens, what's going to happen with the states? There's some challenges with getting poker legal in California. We couldn't get all of the stakeholders aligned. Getting online legal in Pennsylvania, still can't get all the stakeholders aligned. So I think that there's a little bit of enthusiasm about the federal repeal of PASPA, but I think there's going to be some challenges, I think, rolling out inside those states, and that's going to be prevalent, I think, as we look at various other scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of to chime in there, I think a lot of what Dan's getting at is this idea of consensus, right? Something that the AGA is working to do at all points on this is just build consensus among all of the stakeholders that could possibly be invested or interested in furthering this process. And I think that's something that perhaps past efforts haven't had, and that's going to be, regardless of what the Supreme Court says, regardless of whatever the timetable is, I think you're going to have that to have an effective solution. It's going to be one of the key points. But, I mean, as Dan Caselsi said, I mean, right now it is banned. For those that don't know, PASPA stands for the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. A lot of people have heard about it ad nauseum. I don't want to get in, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but it is currently banned. So I think the biggest political obstacle is that it's banned. States cannot institute sports betting schemes, I mean, for the most part, but with the exception of one or two. So, and I think as you talk about building that consensus, as you talk about getting those stakeholders aligned, like Dan said, I mean, something that we've seen through our polling is that laterally over time, opposition to this has really been weakening. The opposition that you saw maybe in the 80s or 90s before technological innovations, before many issues over match fixing or game integrity were not necessarily addressed by robust data solutions, you saw perhaps greater opposition. Now you don't really, it's just not really there. I think building that consensus and gathering people around common points of agreement are what will help drive this forward. I think one of those points of agreement, nearly 7 in 10 Americans view this as a states' rights issue and believe that states should have the ability to decide for themselves whether or not they want to institute sports betting. That number has not been that high in the past, at least in my estimation. That's a really key sticking point. Just one other point I'll say, I mean, this last election that we had was one of the, I think, the most polarizing that we might have had in forever, really. Greater than 50% of Trump voters, greater than 50% of Hillary Clinton voters, greater than 50% of registered independents or people who did not vote for either candidate, all agree that states should have the opportunity to decide for themselves whether or not they want to institute sports betting. I mean, this could really be one of the last issues that there is broad-based, widespread support for, or at the very least, a lack of opposition towards.
And just to touch on back to the Supreme Court case pending from New Jersey, the timeline for that is, from what we've been told, is it's going to be heard probably right before the end of the year, sometime after Thanksgiving, and that would the time frame for a decision from the court would be sometime in the spring. So if the court did deem PASPA to be unconstitutional, states like New Jersey could pretty quickly, with already a state law on the books, implement a sports wagering scheme very quickly. Same thing goes for an expansion of the product in Delaware. They've already got a sports betting law on the books. There's already infrastructure there. You could be seeing, if everything goes, smoothly as far as the Supreme Court, you could see full-scale sports betting in Delaware sometime next summer. And there are many other states that have introduced legislation to position themselves ahead of any change to the federal law. The last count I saw, there was a document the AJ put out, there were 13 states that introduced sports betting bills. And I'm sure there's going to need more before we hear from the Supreme Court. So if states do have laws on their books prior to any sort of movement on PASPA, or any decision that would make it unconstitutional, we could see sports betting in states sometime next year for sure, certainly before football season 2018.
We have, among that document that Dan was speaking to, I mean, we also have, the Delaware example is a great example, the New Jersey example, obviously very, very relevant. Among those 13 states, 3 states have actually passed and enacted, and their governors have signed those laws that were introduced. One of those would be Connecticut. I think there's another sort of Northeast corridor example of a state that's also preparing proactively for this. Their bill called for the establishment of regulations that would govern sports betting in the event that the federal ban is removed, and in the event that Connecticut went ahead and affirmatively legalized it. But it was just kind of another proactive step there as well. So I agree with Dan wholeheartedly. I think you're going to see states be more proactive and aggressive on this, and they're certainly laying the groundwork in an impressive way, and in a way that we didn't really see last year or in past years.
Great. Changing gears a little bit. So with two major sports teams coming to Nevada and more major sports figures becoming open and if not actively supporting, they're at least accepting of the idea of sports betting. So how much influence do the four major sports leagues within the U.S. have on the future of sports betting?
Well, I'll start off on this one. I mean, it's certainly a lot. Obviously, a lot depends on Supreme Court case, which way that goes. But certainly, as we touched on a little bit before, the views of the leagues have evolved quite a bit since PASPA was passed in 1992. As Michael mentioned, you've got the Raiders coming to Vegas. You've got the Golden Knights starting in the NHL in the fall. This is such a evolvement from where the NFL was not that long ago when Las Vegas couldn't even, advertise during the Super Bowl. And now we've got two teams coming to Nevada. We're playing games, NFL games in London and Mexico, two countries with legalized sports betting. So certainly the views of the leagues have evolved. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think the leagues sort of recognize the fan engagement factor from legalized sports betting. They've got a taste of it certainly from daily fantasy sports betting the last couple of years and what kind of fan engagement that brings. Certainly they've been supportive of daily fantasy sports betting, which is really fundamentally another form of sports betting. So they've seen the engagement from that. And the other factor you've got going on really throughout the world is sort of the fragmentation of the TV market. So traditionally, these TV contracts that leagues haven't been so valuable. Now people are getting their information from other sources, from the internet, from various other streaming providers. This is a way potentially to measure and increase fan engagement and continue to monetize fans who are really interested in sports betting. So the views have evolved. We've seen the op-ed piece by Adam Silver. We've seen an evolving stance in the press from the Major League Baseball, and even to some extent the NFL, with the Raiders coming to Vegas and some comments from the commissioner saying, well, it could be okay, I'm paraphrasing, in a regulated environment in Nevada. So you've got a lot of different factors right now. Certainly the leagues can't influence a decision by the Supreme Court at this point, but they certainly can influence any sort of legislation that might run, that might be possible to get done before the Supreme Court decides the case, or sort of after or in parallel with that.
Yeah, just to add to that, Dan, it's their product that we're going to be wagering on. So, they've been trying to figure out how to monetize the industry, and they've started. NBA sold their rights to Sportradar for $250 million over 6 years. The NFL actually bought into Sportradar US, and you can't help but look at the international markets and realize that there's a pretty close relationship between sponsorships and advertising. Dollars that are associated with the sports betting companies and the respective leagues. So massive influence, obviously it's their product, but I think they're trying to figure out how they can monetize it, and they're working through that as we speak.
Okay, moving on. How can domestic best practices help to frame broader sports betting implementation within the U.S.? And by domestic, I'm referring to Nevada.
Well, I can start off on this one. Certainly, Nevada is the gold standard on for regulated sports betting, and from our perspective, it's a great model. There's a lot of it's very convenient. There's a lot of casinos to bet sports betting. And then the state has really embraced technology the last couple of years with the advent of the mobile apps and allowing people to bet wherever they are in the state. Right now, they have to sign up at a brick and mortar casino, licensed casino. Seems to be a good way of doing things because the customer is physically present in the casino. They present positive ID. We run checks so that we know our customer. Certainly seems to be a model that's working very, very well and could be replicated, easily throughout the U.S. So, we're very happy with it. Obviously, there's a number of different models that could take place in the U.S. from pure sort of mobile model to sort of standalone shops like you have in Europe. Sort of pure online sports betting. It's probably tough to see over the next several years just because you've got the Wire Act. So anything interstate is unlikely on the internet. But certainly the interstate model with mobile is a good model, we think, to replicate throughout the U.S.
Yeah, I think also that, we can look outside the industry as well. I think that the level of personalization that we all experience, with our mobile phones, that level of engagement and that level of personalization, without a doubt, is going to be translated into the sports betting industry in the United States. Amazon somehow know exactly what book I'm going to read if I pick, these shoes and maybe that pair of jeans. And that's done by collecting, massive amounts of data and analyzing it and putting that into algorithms and using machine learning to figure out what it is that everybody wants, and then being able to provide that very personalized service. If I only bet on the Tennessee Titans and the Nashville Predators, then just serve me that information, and that's that's going to be the wave of the future, certainly when we talk about the next 3 to 5 years. But the best practices that are happening in other industries, I think we can apply those to sports betting here in the U.S. As it relates to gambling, though, the social and the online gaming, I think, is a great precursor to seeing what will happen with sports betting as an alternative form of gambling. There hasn't been cannibalization. It's an additive product. It's providing a digital extension for land-based casinos, and we know that the land-based casinos and the racinos are the ones in the queue that are going to get the sports betting licenses probably as these states roll out. So it's really about extending it, and you can look at those great case studies about casinos in Tropicana in New Jersey and how they've rolled out a digital form that enhances the experience of the casino. It ties in loyalty programs, and it just makes the entire experience better.
So just to add to that, I would say 3 things sort of jump out in addition to what Dan and Dan also said. I guess one of them kind of complements Dan Shapiro's initial statement. To me, consumer awareness is a big one. So how sports betting is marketed can be a sensitive subject, but at the same time, I think it's important for operators to think more about the space and invest more in this space, and they certainly will as it expands. I say that because 62% of Americans do not know accurately whether or not sports betting is legal where they are. Like, think about that. Like if they guessed, they would do better at, determining the legality of sports betting. So I think a lot of that has to get back to consumer awareness, consumers being aware of their local laws and products that are available, and how operators could maybe, play an additional role in that. I also think information sharing and collaboration, continuing to do that, especially at the operator level, is especially key. We think, operators in Nevada, on the sportsbook side at least, have done a really, really good job, an increasingly good job recently of, collaborating with other stakeholders in the space, but also sharing information with regulators that regulators might need to know, and viewing, the regulatory board there in Nevada as a partner and somebody who they can work with. And vice versa. I think that sort of almost self-regulatory approach as a complement to the existing massive suite of just day-to-day regulations and statutes that they have to follow, I think is very, very important, because it shows that the industry is collaborating with itself and with regulatory bodies as well. So that can only help as we move forward with more and more states coming online with this product.
Yeah, just to add to that, there's a lot of discussion about integrity and how does that factor into expanded legalized sports betting. And I think the important point that we always like to get across is that we are aligned with the sports leagues on integrity. We rely on fair games with outcomes we can rely on. If we see suspicious activity, we're going to report it immediately to a regulator, which in this case is the Nevada Gaming Control Board, and then they're going to take the investigation from there and take it up with the FBI and/or the sports leagues. And there's a process with the Gaming Control Board in place for reporting suspicious activity. A similar process could be replicated in other states, where sports betting might be legal. But there's a lot of regulation and compliance measures in Nevada that we think are really strong, and that should be replicated throughout the U.S. Computerized betting systems allow us to track in real time, transactions and data. There's video surveillance of all the transactions, and that's even without getting into all the Title 31 requirements at the federal level, which we're mindful of every day: anti-money laundering, KYCs, all those types of things. So these sort of practices that we live every day in Nevada, we think can certainly be translated into a national sports betting market.
Great. Moving on. So obviously, international sports betting is a much more mature market relative to the U.S. So especially for land-based casinos that may be in a position to get operating licenses once sports betting becomes legal, what can potential domestic sports betting operators learn from established international operators? Dan Kostelski, since you have the most experience abroad, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, when you're in a hyper-competitive market, it's the value of the customer. Net revenues, regulated books in Europe spend 25 to 30% of their marketing, of their net revenues on marketing. And that's a huge number, and that just goes to show you how hard it is to acquire customers, and we'll talk about acquisition and retention, but how hard it is to acquire customers and retain them. So if at the core of in the U.S., if we look at how valuable these customers can be, I think Dan, I think William Hill spent $162 on per new depositing customer in Europe in 2016. That's a lot of money per customer, and if you multiply that by how many exist here in the United States, that's a massive number. So putting the customer at the core and then working on all of the really good products and features, product breadth, having lots of markets, having lots of sports is going to be critical. Offering it on mobile, if you put your customer at the center of the universe, then you figure out pretty quickly what drives those customers and their habits, and then you work around that. And I think that's certainly something that the Europeans do, and it's certainly something that's going to happen here in the United States when more operators come online if it's nationally legislated.
Sure, and just to echo some of the things Dan Kay said, the product is important, right? William Hill came to the U.S. We wanted to offer a very extensive product. Really the competition in new states opening up is going to be the offshore illegal bookmakers, right? A lot of them have advanced, very good products with very competitive pricing. It's very important that the product breadth and offering is competitive with what customers might be used to finding elsewhere. So it's not just sort of the vanilla, major sports, point spread, money line total. We're talking about in-depth product with lots of props and futures that are fairly priced. We're talking about in-play betting, which is now For us, about close to 25% of our wagering overall in Nevada. In Europe, some places it's well over 50%. All these types of things are what customers are demanding and what they're finding, in their sort of other options, other illegal options. So it's important that operators consider that that's really the competition, and you've got to have a product that is competitive, with those offerings. And it's not easy to offer. It takes a lot of a staff to be able to offer such a breadth of product. When you're talking about in-play wagering, when you're talking about international sports, those types of things, you really need a good core of bookmaking or data provisions so that you can offer these wide range of product. The other thing I'll touch on goes back to the customer's convenience. If you don't have mobile, customers are going to access illegal ways to bet through mobile or offshore. So convenience is important. Payments are another big consideration. The easier it is to get money into the accounts, the more customers are going to get toward legal methods of betting, because that is an issue in the illegal market, is the payments and settlements. So if I had to leave with two things that operators should really keep in mind, it's product and convenience. Those are the two big factors.
Yeah, I think there's two separate but very closely linked conversations here, and one is drawing from the European market, which has been obviously very well established for a very long time. It's very heavily regulated, and drawing from what's been a successful product over there and why. And I think that's incredibly, totally valid. There's also this, you heard both Dans reference the offshore market. For those who might not know, what we mean by that are websites that are based in the Caribbean. These websites, by and large, are licensed in their jurisdiction, but they will poach often U.S. customers. A guy sitting on a couch in Ohio who wants to bet on sports, for example, and it's not legal to do that where that bettor is. This is a bit of a, I mean, it's similar, but it's a slightly separate conversation to me, but it really speaks a lot to one of the points that Dan Shapiro brought up, I think, which was a competitive odds. So, for example, if I am able to sit on my couch and bet on, I don't know, the New England Patriots to win, say I bet $100 on them to win a game against the spread against, another team, and I do that through an offshore website, there's a decent chance that I might get a higher payout, the money coming back to me could be greater than if I put that same amount of money down at an onshore casino, at a Vegas book. Offering competitive pricing and competitive odds like that, I think, is one thing that will really be essential for, domestic books as much as they can, to do going forward. And we talk a lot about this illegal market. We're commissioning a study right now. It's not released yet. I mentioned H2 Gambling Capital is one of the vendors earlier on this call, and we're doing a study with them that sort of establishes sort of a size and scope of the entire illegal market. And one of the facets of that is what is the U.S. generated business for these websites that are based in, Antigua, Curacao, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, et cetera, et cetera. And we're looking at an annual handle just from U.S. users alone, and these sites operate almost worldwide. We're looking at just a U.S. generated handle alone on those sites of about $20 billion annually. Again, that's like 4 to 5 times the size of Nevada, right, or the entire U.S. So I think that's a testament to the fact that, like it or not, sometimes offshore operators are offering a product that has convenience and that has good pricing. And I think in terms of a domestic, I'll let Dan and Dan speak to this, or if they disagree, maybe they do. But I think going forward, if you're a domestic operator, combating that in several ways is going to be very, very essential. And like Dan Shapiro said, it's about offering a very competitive product. I think the operators have the ability to do that.
One other thing I'll throw in real quick that I probably falls into this conversation, and that we focus on a lot at William Hill and bringing learnings over from international markets is really player management, customer management. Really understanding your customers, because it is a risk business, and there's days weeks when sportsbooks can lose money, and it's important to know who your customers are, tracking patterns of customers who have the potential to beat you over a long period of time, and knowing when to how to manage yields from different customers. So that's another important thing, and that's all driven by data and data analysis, and that's something we focus on quite a bit, and that's something that a lot of the offshore or international operators focus on quite a bit. So it is a sophisticated sort of way of looking at the customer and really sort of knowing their behaviors, what they're betting, when they're betting it, and how much they're betting.
Great. Moving on, since we're running a little short on time and we want to leave at least some time at the end for audience Q&A, I'll combine the next two questions. They're related. So first part, what benefits does sports betting provide to gaming properties? And then as a follow-up, what sports betting related strategies have Nevadan and international gaming properties employed to enhance customer acquisition and retention?
I'll kick that off. The first one is obviously a new revenue stream for the casinos. I experienced that firsthand when we sold our sports book to a land-based casino group and integrated it in with all the loyalty programs. And I mean, not only did it improve the size of the book, but customers that wagered on my sports book, then spent 50% more inside the casinos. And that's probably the biggest value that sports betting will be able to provide. Yes, Will was talking about, I think it was 12 billion in GGR. That's a massive opportunity, and bringing that into the casinos will be a game changer. But also maybe as a slight derivative to that, it's about also creating engagements, driving people from the sports books and having good events at the casinos and driving foot traffic into the casinos, whether that's from online to offline, and also offering just great content and engagement with the customers even when they're not in the casino premises. The last one is, I'm not going to mention the M word, but it is a younger demographic. The value of a sports of bringing in a sports book is probably going to bring in a younger generation than the average age of your loyalty program. And so on my sports book, I had an average age of 28, and we integrated that into a land-based casino where the average age of the loyalty program was 45 plus. Same thing with the horse racing tracks. The horse racing, invariably the average age of the horse racing gambler is 45 plus. And if the sports betting products are provided by the tracks, it'll give the tracks a great opportunity to attract a younger generation.
And just to add to that, sports betting, at least in Vegas, is such a event-driven type of gambling, and what you've got is massive amounts of betting occurring during March Madness. It becomes one of the highest visited weekends of the year in Vegas, at least the first 4 days of March Madness. During football season, every Saturday and Sunday become major events in the casino. Super Bowl obviously is a huge day. And what increasingly casinos and what we're doing here in Nevada is building these sort of integrated experiences around food and beverage and nice bars and nicer areas to hang out for the day and watch sports and bet on it on your mobile device or over the counter even, and really sort of keeping people in the sports books and engaged through in-play wagering and different sorts of things. So I think you're going to see sports books and operators move more toward this sort of all-encompassing integrated experience where you can really attract customers to a property and retain them for a significant period of time with a whole bunch of things going on in a very exciting, activated area of the casino.
Yeah, to caveat that, Dan, in South Africa, the 65% of all the people that went to casinos also bet on sports. So I mean, there's a massive correlation between those two, and that's certainly a massive opportunity for the casino groups.
Great. So we'll touch on this next question briefly, just because I know many gaming operators that are listening will have some interest in this. So what are the biggest risks facing sports betting operators?
I'll give two, really. I mean, one is certainly compliance. You know, we have a saying at William Hill, you know, every customer is important, but no customer is too important. We spend a lot of time making sure we know who our biggest customers are, you know, where they're getting their money. You know, we're always monitoring for suspicious activity. It's something, if you don't follow very closely and put together the right compliance department and personnel and culture of compliance, that can get folks in trouble, and we've seen that in the industry. So that's one risk factor from my perspective, compliance. You know, another is, you know, really putting in place the right risk management team as far as the bookmaking side. You know, either an operator might contract it to a third party like a William Hill, or if an operator's going to do it themselves, they got to realize that you know, this is a business where you can lose money. It's not like putting a few slot machines on the floor in a certain area and knowing and getting a reasonably good idea of what they're going to yield over some period of time. There's fluctuations in sports betting. The results can wildly be volatile if favorites are lining up. So it's really important to have a solid risk management strategy and be able to sort of, you know, stomach the ups and lows if you know, a casino is going to manage a book themselves, because if you're not watching it closely and if you're not managing customers right, it is a business where you can lose money over a given period of time.
Just to add to that, Dan, value and I mean, offering value at the right price, we talked about that. That's a massive risk, and if people are operating in a state where the tax regime requires you know, for you not to be able to offer a good price on markets, it's going to be a risk for that state's books. Competitive products we talked about. It's about breadth and depth and availability, and making sure that's on point. But I think right now there's a massive risk of people actually not doing anything. You know, the sports betting, if you're an early adopter, there are things that you should be doing right now. You know, consolidating your database, talking to them about sports betting, or providing, you know, play for fun games, or doing something to understand your existing casino database or your media database, and understanding about their propensity to gamble. Because if you wait until legislation or until legalization, you're probably going to be too late. There are too many people that are operating right now that are trying to help companies you know, understand those 30 million people that are betting in the United States already.
All right. Our final question before we move on to the audience Q&A. I know we've touched on this throughout the webinar, but where do the three of you think domestic sports betting will be in the next 3 to 5 years and beyond within the U.S.?
I'll go ahead and I'll give a very a simple crack at that answer. I think we're going to see expanded sports betting in the U.S. I think states will come online as they so choose. I think that this is going to be a state-by-state solution, and we're going to see sports betting expand where there is the demand, expand where, kind of like Dan was just talking about, except on a more like a state government level, where people have done the groundwork, where people have tried to get ahead of the game in various states. As we said, just as there have been 16 states that have passed and enacted DFS laws in the last year or two, it's not just like things like DFS that are having momentum. It's literal sports betting laws as well, sports betting bills. There are 14 states that have introduced either bills and or resolutions calling for legalized sports betting. As we said, 3 of those have already passed. We expect in 2018 that number to be just as high, if not higher. So yeah, I don't know if we'll see blanket all 50 states anytime soon, but I mean, this is something where the momentum is too great for there not to be continued expanded sports betting. So I would guess several states are online in 3 to 5 years.
And my take would be that the product is going to be very different. I think it's going to advance at a very rapid rate. I'm a huge proponent of personalization and offering people exactly what they want. And then things like voice activation, Alexa and Siri, placing your bets through voice activation, I think is going to be large as well. And it's just applying a lot of best practices that happen in other industries to the sports betting industry because people are used to that as consumers, and sports betting products will align, I think, over the next 3 to 5 years with those.
Sure. Next 3 to 5 years, we'd like to think that, there's going to be legalized sports betting in many states throughout the U.S. Obviously, a Supreme Court case coming up this year is going to determine the speed of that, really. But I think, if we do get sports betting legal in many states in the next 3 to 5 years, I think, interestingly, I think you're going to see the sports leagues continually embrace it, like you see in Europe with soccer teams and in the EPL, where increasingly they're going to look to monetize that revenue stream, and you're going to see logos on jerseys and advertisements during the games and data sharing agreements and things like that in the U.S. that have been pretty taboo up to this point. So I think you're just going to see that experience sort of evolve and become a very much more socially acceptable form of entertainment over the next 5 years, should sports betting become legal throughout the U.S.
Great. We have some time for a couple audience questions. There's some common themes throughout these. So the first theme, I guess, is just on some of the sports teams coming to Vegas and the eventual logistics around betting. So do you guys think that the NHL and NFL, since those are the teams that are coming to Vegas as of now, will request books not be allowed to allow wagers on those sports and teams, or will it be treated similar to the NASCAR races at the Las Vegas Speedway, allowing wagers on the events?
I'll start off on this one. So far, to our knowledge, there hasn't been any objection by the Golden Knights of the NHL as far as wagering on the team in Vegas, and we'll see what happens with the Raiders. The teams can petition to the Gaming Commission to ask that their games be excluded from wagering in Nevada, but based on comments from the commission, it's unlikely that they would be entertaining any sort of ban on wagering on teams playing in Las Vegas. As Mike said, there's wager on NASCAR event. The Summer League was here over the summer just recently in Vegas, and we had record betting handle on the NBA Summer League, and we have betting regularly on UNLV basketball and football games here in Vegas. So to say that there shouldn't be wagering on teams that are playing here in Nevada is sort of counter to the argument that legalized sports betting is a good thing. So I don't see any sort of ban in the future here.
Yeah, and the caveat to that is that when the NFL goes to London, they allow wagering on those games, and in fact, the games that are being played in London are, I think, they're wagered on at a factor of 10 times other games that are being played on that same weekend. So, one data point, which is the NFL, they don't do it in London. I can't imagine that they'll do it in Vegas.
And so final question of the webinar. We had a few questions on just tribal interest in sports betting. So if any of the three of you have any opinion on just, is there any differentiation between the interest in tribal casinos versus commercial casinos obtaining sports betting licenses?
I certainly would not ever try to speak for the tribes. They are tribal sovereign governments. They are sovereign, and I would never presume to know their interests. What I will say is that the tribes, I think, are essential to this consensus building effort. The National Indian Gaming Association just joined our sports betting coalition. That was huge to have their involvement. They absolutely have to be at the table, as does every other stakeholder in this. I feel like to be able to drive the consensus that's going to get the greatest number of states on board. I would note one potential distinction is that, there are 28 states in this country that have tribal gaming. There are 24 states in this country that have commercial gaming. Some of those states, of course, overlap. Some of those states are distinct. In states where, for example, you just have tribal gaming, a reality on the ground there is that almost certainly, unlike in a commercial state, if you're in a tribal state, you would have to amend the compact that is sort of the agreement between the tribe and the state that governs, what gaming can and can't be offered there. I think that would be one element to consider at the tribal level that is just, it might not change things or it might change things, but it's just something to be aware of as opposed to a law dealing more so at a state level in some state just with commercial interests. But I think overall it's incredibly important that the tribes have a seat at the table and, are a part of sort of driving consensus on this going forward.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, they've got half of the casinos in the U.S. and I venture to say if you look at their footprint, they've got a large number of sports bettors already on their casino loyalty databases, and they need to start mining them. They need to start acting on that. And if they don't, then somebody else will. Whether that's other casino groups or media companies or other people that are interested in the value of having that sports bettor on their own database. So yeah, they need to establish a strategy and certainly coming to the table and being part of the the legalization effort is critical to that.
All right, as I said, that's our last question for the webinar. Before we sign off, we want to thank Will and both Dans for taking the time to join us today. Also, thanks to Marie for ensuring the webinar ran smoothly. Attendees, please be sure to visit theinnovationgroup.com for more information on emerging leaders as well as our firm. And be sure to follow us on social media. Thanks to everyone for joining today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Mike. Cheers, everybody.